When Barry White died in 2003, the tributes came from everywhere. The voice, the records, the legacy. The 100 million people who had heard something in the music that they could not find anywhere else. The couples who associated his name with the most private moments of their lives. The journalists who wrote about the depth of the voice and the warmth of the sound and the distance between South Central Los Angeles and the concert stages of London and Paris. Almost none of those tributes mentioned Gene Page, the man who had built the sound around the voice, who had written every string arrangement, every horn line, every orchestral architecture that gave Barry White's records their particular weight and warmth, had been gone for 5 years already. He died in 1998. He was 58 years old. Barry White died in 2003. He was 58 years old. Two men who built 100 million records together, both gone at the same age, 5 years apart. One of them mourned by the world. The other quietly, without ceremony, without a fraction of the recognition that the work deserved. This is Gene Page's story, the one that almost never gets told. Eugene Tharpe Page was born in Los Angeles in 1939. He grew up in a city that was, in the 1940s and 1950s, becoming the center of the American recording industry. The studios were here. The session musicians were here. The infrastructure that turned music into product was being built in Los Angeles in real time. And for a young man with a serious musical education and an ear that could hear the gap between what a recording was and what it could be, the city was the right place to be. He studied music formally, classical training, theory, the full architecture of Western composition. He understood the orchestra the way that very few people in the popular music world understood it, not as decoration applied to a song after the fact, but as a structural element, as fundamental to the emotional meaning of the music as the melody itself. He began working as an arranger in the 1960s, session work mostly, the invisible labor of someone who writes the parts that other people play, who creates the sonic environment that makes a voice or a melody mean what it is supposed to mean. He worked on records that people loved without knowing his name. He built things that other people received credit for in the way that the music industry had always distributed its recognition, toward the face, away from the hands. He was very good at it. He was, by the early 1970s, one of the most skilled arrangers in Los Angeles. The people who worked with him understood what they were getting. The people who listened to the records he worked on did not know they were getting anything from him at all. That was, in the economy of session work, exactly how it was supposed to work. Then Barry White played him a rough recording of what would become their first collaboration. What Gene Page heard in that rough recording was not a finished thing. It was a voice. A register nobody had built a career around. A depth that the industry had spent a decade deciding had no market. A raw, unproduced performance that had all the emotional content of what Barry White was trying to say and none of the architectural support to make it land the way it needed to land. Gene Page heard that and understood something specific. The voice needed a world around it. Not accompaniment, a world. The strings needed to move the way the voice moved, slowly, deliberately, with the particular weight of something that had been somewhere. The horns needed to give the record its structure without overwhelming the intimacy that was the voice's primary quality. The arrangements needed to create space, the specific kind of space that makes a listener feel held rather than impressed. This was not a technical problem. It was a musical one. And Gene Page was among the very few people in Los Angeles in 1972 who had both the classical training and the popular music sensibility to solve it. He sat down and began writing. What he produced over the following weeks became the sound, Not Barry White's sound specifically, but the sound that the two of them made together. The sound that would eventually reach 100 million people in the small private spaces where they kept the things that mattered most to them. The collaboration was not equal in the way that the credit it received was not equal. Both men understood this. Gene Page was a session arranger. That was the category. The category came with specific terms about recognition and compensation and the direction in which the world pointed its attention. He accepted the terms. He kept working. The sessions that produced the Barry White catalog of the 1970s were, by every account of the people present, experiences of considerable musical intensity. Gene Page ran the orchestral recordings with the authority of someone who had written every note and knew exactly what each musician needed to play and why. The string sections, the horn players, the woodwinds, all of them reading charts that Page had produced in the hours and days before each session. Charts that were dense and specific and built on a musical logic that took the voice as its organizing principle and worked outward from there. Barry White was present for these sessions, behind the glass of the control room, listening to what was being built for him. The relationship between the two men was, by the accounts available, one of genuine mutual respect. Barry White understood what Gene Page was doing. He understood the scale of the contribution. He spoke about it in interviews, not often enough perhaps, but with evident sincerity when he did. The music business around them understood it differently. Gene Page's name appeared in the liner notes of every Barry White record. It was there, in the small print in the credits list that ran alongside the production notes and the engineering acknowledgments and the label copy. Arranged and conducted by Gene Page. The words were there every time. The world read past them every time. This is not unusual in the music industry. It is, in fact, the standard arrangement. The face receives the recognition, the hands receive the credit, and the distinction between those two things is worth, in terms of cultural memory, more than any other distinction the industry makes. What was unusual in this case was the scale of the gap. The Barry White sound, the specific combination of voice and orchestra that made the records what they were, was not one person's creation. It was two people's creation. And one of those two people was, for the entire duration of the collaboration and for the years after it ended, almost entirely invisible to the world that consumed what they had built together. Gene Page worked with Barry White through the height of the catalog, the records that defined the sound, that charted across the world, that became the backdrop for a generation's most private experiences. He worked on other projects, too. He was a working arranger, not exclusively tied to one artist, and his skill was in demand across the Los Angeles session world in the ways that serious craft is always in demand in environments where serious craft is rare. But the Barry White work was the work by which his contribution would eventually be measured, in the small circles of people who measured such things. By the 1980s, the recording industry had changed in ways that reduced the role of the orchestral arranger. Synthesizers, drum machines, the shift toward electronic production. The world that had needed someone to write for 30 strings and 12 horns was being replaced by a world that could approximate those sounds with fewer people and less money. Gene Page adapted. He kept working. He was a serious musician, and serious musicians find ways to continue in whatever environment the industry creates for them. But the kind of work he had done with Barry White in the 1970s, the full orchestral sessions, the dense arrangements, the specific architecture of strings and voice that had produced the sound, belonged to a moment that was passing. He died on August 24, 1998. The Los Angeles Times ran a brief obituary. The music trade publications noted the passing of an important session arranger. The wider world, the 100 million people whose living rooms and cars had been full of his work for 25 years, did not notice. There is a question that Gene Page's story raises that the music industry does not have a satisfying answer to. It is not the question of fairness. The distribution of recognition in the music business has never been fair and is not designed to be. The question is narrower and more specific than that. It is, what do we lose when we do not know the name? When a person hears a Barry White record and feels something, in the voice, in the warmth of the sound, in the specific quality of the strings moving behind the melody, and attributes that feeling entirely to one source, they are receiving an incomplete account of what they are experiencing. The feeling is real. The attribution is partial. Gene Page's work is in that feeling. It is in the architecture of every record, in the decisions about where the strings enter and where they give way to the voice, in the specific density of the arrangements that creates the sensation of being held by something larger than a single instrument or a single person. He built the room that the voice inhabited. Without the room, the voice is different, smaller perhaps, less weighted with the specific quality of warmth and depth that made the records what they were. Barry White understood this. In the interviews where he spoke about Gene Page, not often enough but with evident sincerity when he did, he described a collaboration of equals, a creative partnership in which the arranger's contribution was not secondary but structural. The world heard this and continued to attribute the records to one name. Gene Page died in 1998, 58 years old, his name in the liner notes of every record that mattered, his contribution audible in every note of every arrangement, his recognition approximately proportional to the space his name occupied in the small print at the bottom of the credits page. Barry White died in 2003, 58 years old, mourned by the world in the way that the world mourns the faces of things. Two men, the same age, the same work. A gap in recognition that the music cannot explain and the industry cannot justify, and the listener, hearing the records now with the knowledge of what went into them, can feel in a new way. Not as an injustice that requires correction. Gene Page is beyond correction now, but as an invitation to listen differently, to hear in the warmth of the strings and the movement of the orchestra behind the voice the work of a man whose name was always there, in the small print, waiting to be read. His name was Gene Page. Now you know it. If this story stayed with you, if there is someone in your own life whose contribution has gone unnoticed, whose name belongs in a sentence that has never included it, tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe. The ones behind the names. The ones in the small print. There are more to tell.